Hey everyone. So tonight is the first good clear night that I'm having in about 3 weeks, and I figured I would show off my deep sky imaging setup. Uh, give you guys an idea of basically what my setup process is and what equipment I actually use for my images. So main thing is this Orion Cirrus EQG mount. It's a 30-pound mount. It's equivalent to or basically a clone of the Skywatcher HEQ5. On top of it, I've got this TPO 6-inch f4 imaging Newtonian. That's a 610 millimeter focal length. And then on top, we've got this ASI 1600 mm Pro CWL filter wheel, moonlight autofocuser. Just got a 50 millimeter guide scope and a ASI 120 as my guide camera. The filters I have in here are astronomic LRGB and CLS filters, and an Astrodon 5nm hydrogen and 3nm oxygen. Tonight I'm hoping to start imaging the Eastern Veil Nebula in bicolor. Last night it was clear for a little bit and I did some test exposures, made sure the framing looked good, but tonight I'm actually going to sink some time into it. It'll probably be about an hour after Astrodark before it's high enough up to image. Even though I have this gorgeous view all the way to the horizon to the east, I still don't like to image targets that are below 30 degrees. It's just the atmosphere really distorts the image so much. Until then, I'll probably just shoot some globular cluster and add it to my Messier catalog. And of course, just got a rat's nest of cables, which run inside to my desktop. I'm sorry if the audio is bad. I've got all these air conditioners out here that are pretty noisy. So how I set the equipment up, basically I store it inside just like this, all in one piece, and I carry it outside all in one piece. Uh, it's not too heavy. Does require a little bit of maneuvering to get it through the door. I've got the tripod legs about as far as I can extend them out without smacking into the door frame. And I'll bring it out here and you can see I've got 3 little pieces of tape on the ground to just get me roughly a line north to Polaris. But once it gets darker out, I'll use the polar scope on the telescope mount and fine tune my polar alignment and get it nice and accurate. So once it's out here, I usually like to take it out maybe an hour or two before Astrodark, and probably 30 minutes to an hour before Astrodark, I will use the flats wizard in Nina and take flats for all the images I'm taking. So since I'm going to be doing a globular cluster and the Veil Nebula tonight, I'm going to take flats for my LRGB, HA, and O3 filters. So let's pop on into Nina and start up that routine. Alright, I've got Nina loaded up, and uh, off camera I just made sure everything was plugged in and turned on, and now I've got all of my wonderful equipment connected to Nina. And I'm here in the imaging tab, and let's unpark the mounts for this next step. So one thing I love about Nina is the flats wizard. It's about 30 minutes before sunset, which is a perfect time to take some flats. Let's make sure we have the gain set correctly in the binning. I absolutely love the flats wizard in Nina. It's so nice just being able to sit inside, just let it automatically do all the flats for me. And I do love the slew to zenith feature as well. I can just leave the mount powered on and not have to worry about unclutching it and all that stuff. So let's let it slew. Okay, good enough. So doing an open or a globular cluster tonight and the Veil Nebula, so let's use some LRGB. Now one thing I always do is take a test exposure, because typically the first image that comes in whenever I do an imaging session is bad. Okay, this one's not, but usually there's some data loss or something. the image, half of it looks all staticky. If I have an example from a different imaging session, I'll throw it up on screen now. And I've already had the cooler set to go to negative 10°C. Probably drop it down to negative 15 once the sun's set and it gets a little bit colder out. And oh yeah, got some dust on the filter. But that's why we shoot flats. So let's start the flat sequence. Let all these roll in. Okay, it's a little bit later. Had a slight issue with the camera SDK, but I did manage to get 30 flat frames for each of my filters. I always stack my flats in PixInsight, usually right after I take them, and that way I can delete the gigabytes upon gigabytes of raw flats files and just have, 6 instead of more than 100. I stack these according to the Light Vortex Astronomy pre-processing tutorial, what it recommends for stacking flat frames. I will have a link to that in the description down below or in whatever card annotation thing YouTube has. But yeah, I've got 30 flats for each filter, and let's stack them. Alright, so it's a little bit later. I've got all the flats stacked and saved, and as you can see, I've got a couple of dust motes that made it through, especially here and here. It's a little squiggly. That's always been on my oxygen filter ever since I got it, but it's not on any of the others. I'm not really sure where all this dust is in the imaging train, since these two in particular, they show up on every single flat that I've stacked, and I got a couple other donuts that are just appearing on one filter each, but that's why we have flats. And just to show you guys, this is a master dark I made of 30 darks at negative 20 or negative 15 Celsius. I don't calibrate my flats with the darks at all. There's no need to really unless I'm doing flats that are, multiple seconds long, in which case I have to worry about this amp glow. But since I'm doing sky flats, it's not a problem for me. Yeah, Master Dark. And then I've gone ahead and put in my sequence for tonight. I'm going to do an hour on Messier 10. It's a globular cluster. And then the rest of the night I'll spend on the Veil. I did do a couple of test exposures on the Veil last night. As you can see, I've got hydrogen and an oxygen here. And I'm going to use this hydrogen image as my reference for centering the image in Nina. So I've gone ahead and plate solved this and put in the exact coordinates into the target coordinates here. And also I did make a HOO bicolor just with these two uncalibrated, even unaligned frames just to see what I'm looking at. And based off of just 10 minutes of data, this is going to be a sweet project. I'm hoping to get at least 20 hours on it, plus a little bit of RGB color for the stars. But yeah, it's 9 o'clock. Sunset was about 15 or so minutes ago. And I'm just going to wait for it to get darker out. I can do my polar alignment and then plate solving, autofocus. So we'll come back when that's ready. Okay, I got the outside light on and the phone light. I've just gone ahead and make sure that I've got my dew heater turned on. Don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but running through this cable I've got power USB, but also this dew heater strap. I think the first time I actually imaged with this thing, the filters dewed over, so this should keep whatever filters in front of the camera nice and warm and dew free. Anyways, on to the actual polar alignment. Just take these off and rotate this 90 degrees. It's a nice view of my shirt in the mirror. Now, a lot of people go through a lot of efforts, doing sharp cap or drift aligning and all that, I just use an app on my phone called Polar Scope Align Pro, and just kind of eyeball the damn thing, and get it close enough. I've never really noticed an effect of, you know, okay-ish polar alignment on my images. If I didn't polar align, I know right away something's wrong. PhD guiding does absolutely not like it. If I'm not just, ballpark polar aligned. But the great thing about having all this tape on the ground is, Polaris is pretty much always in the field of view of this polar scope whenever I end up using it. Yeah, let's try this with the flash off. Alright, well, couldn't get this show up on video without the flash, but I did manage to get a picture of it, so I'll throw that up on the screen now. But yeah, I just really eyeball it and not worry too much about the polar alignment being, a few arc minutes off. I've noticed virtually no effect in my images, and let's see if I can get this thing on. It's usually finicky. Yeah, whatever. And polar alignment is really the only thing that I have to be outside for. I've got my setup pretty much automated except for polar alignments, and I don't really think of a way I can effectively automate that unless I somehow put a pier on the roof of my apartment, but that's another story. Anyways, now that that's done, I'll just leave the scope here, double check everything's plugged in, good to go, and then stay inside for the rest of the night. Okay, everything is polar aligned and we're all looking good. Probably wait a little bit to bring the camera temperature down to -15. It's usually what I like to shoot at. Or I might just shoot the glob reel coaster at -10 and the veil at -15 once it cools off. Now let's go and plate solve this, make sure that the mount knows where it's pointing. For my plate solving, show you my configuration in Nina. I like to use the ASTAP plate solver. I used to use the PlateSolve 2 plate solver, but I found ASTAP is a lot faster, particularly on my laptop when I'm imaging from a dark site. And if that fails, it'll just upload to astronomy or astrometry and plate solve there. And yeah, and still from last night, looks pretty in focus. Let's check the HFR. 1.11. I mean, this is only a 5-second exposure, but regardless, I'll still run an autofocus. Let's just remember the position of this. Oh, these buttons are new. That's one of the neat things about being on the nightly versions of Nina. They can be buggy, but you do get the newest features on them before they're released to the general public. You can also check in on PhD and get this looping. And my guide scope pretty much just stays in focus all the time. So I don't have to worry about refocusing it unless I pack everything up and travel. But yeah, usually about this time I double check, make sure that especially the sequence is good. And if I start this in probably, I don't know, half an hour, this should get done at about 4:45 in the morning. I think After Dark ends at about 4:40, so maybe 4:50. I always tweak things as I go along and just pausing the sequence and changing the number of frames here. Regardless of all that, I always make sure in EQ mod, once I have a sequence started and say I want to go to bed or something, I'll figure out how long it is until After Dark and probably, or the end of After Dark, and put in the number of minutes until then, plus maybe like 20 minutes just in case the sequence goes a little bit past the end of AstroDark. And I have a custom park mode set on EQ mod called No Dust. Uh, Basically, instead of the normal park mode where the mount parks pointing towards Polaris, the No Dust park mode has the telescope pointing down at the ground. I always do that just so, stuff doesn't fall into the tube at all or gets on the mirror, or like a bird doesn't come shit in it. Uh, oh yeah, we got a nice autofocus curve right here. This little bit on the right, it always does that for some reason. And let's see, 80/29. That's right at the bottom of that curve. Oh, and the automatically starts guiding once it's done. Let's see how this looks. I'm running 2-second guiding exposures here. It took a bit of trial and error to figure out the right settings for my particular setup, but once I've locked those settings in, I have not had to change them at all, and my guiding has been really good. Occasionally I'll have to go to modify calibration and clear the guiding calibration, but that's if I take the camera off the guide scope and it rotates a little bit. But yeah, I'm getting around 0.78. My guiding when I'm not super low in the sky is usually around zero point 0.8 arc seconds total RMS error. And my pixel scale with ASI 1600 at about, was it 610 millimeters focal length? My pixel scale is 1.28 arc seconds, so really anything below that is okay. Even sometimes I've seen the guide error peak above that and the frames still turn out fine. We got a little bit of something going on here. Maybe a gust of wind. I do know my scope has some, or my mount has some pretty bad deck backlash. I should probably fix that at some point. Anyway, let's see how well this autofocus worked. And let's go point it at Vega. Dark, if you're watching this, fix this. Have PhD slew, or pause whenever it slews somewhere. Please. For my own sanity. I always like to check the, I guess, sort of live feed on PhD whenever I slew somewhere, just so I know when the mount actually stops slewing. I don't have to rely on staring at these numbers. And based off of this, I'm pretty sure Vega is not in the frame, so let's run the plate solver. First time it slews somewhere, it's usually off, but once it starts moving around and plate solves, it finds its way pretty quick. Yep. Got a halo, probably left the light on out there. There's Vega. Yeah, let's plate solve this. One of the things I like about Newtonian scopes is you can check your focus just based off the diffraction spikes. Okay, I guess I wasn't done slewing. Let's try this again. There we go. Telescope synced. It's our HFR here. HFR of 1.17, that's pretty good. Looking at these spikes. Yeah, they're a little bit off. Let's see if we move that 10 positions there. Do another 5-second exposure. 2.15, but there's only 4 spikes. Earlier, these were double spikes going this way, so I'm going to say that's in focus. I might redo the autofocus just before I start imaging, just in case the scope cooled down and it changed a little bit with the temperature change. So in the meantime, I've gone ahead and centered the target for tonight. It is Messier number 10. It's a boring old globular cluster, but I'm on a mission to photograph all 110 objects in the Messier catalog. Currently, I am at 60 Messier objects, and I'll probably reshoot a couple of them, but my goal is to do all 110, and obviously you gotta do all of them, even the boring ones. I'm only gonna do an hour on it before the moon comes up, and then switch over to the veil and do some narrowband data on it. Uh, Exposures I'm doing, because of my heavy light pollution, I'm in a Bortle 7 zone. I can only do 30-second luminance exposures and 60-second RGB exposures. Uh, and I've found that works out pretty well for my setup in particular, being at f4 and under this heavy light pollution. Narrowband stuff, I usually just do 5-minute exposures. And you can see I already did some test guiding here. Let me pull up in PhD. And this is some deck backlash. Again, I'm not really sure the best way to fix it, but most of my images turn out fine despite the deck backlash, and it usually gets better as the night goes on. One thing I do like is seeing the object itself in the guide cam as well. It's always a nice little treat when it's something, this bright. But anyways, focus seems good. Camera, probably bump that to -15 before we start. And again, it is about 30 minutes before Astrodark actually starts. Tomorrow is the summer solstice, which means we get the least amount of astronomical darkness in the northern hemisphere here, and some of the longest times between sunset and actual true darkness. It's just like to tab through these. Also, in case anyone is wondering, I am using focus offsets for my different filters. The astronomics I have are pretty much parfocal. I've noticed the red is usually about a little bit off from the rest of them. And then the astrodons I don't have a sulfur yet, so this is just an empty slats, but the astrodons are truly parfocal, but they're a little bit off from the astronomic filters. And just a little bit longer until the camera gets to -15. They say you usually don't want to go above 80% on your cooler power. Just makes it more difficult for the camera to adjust to temperature changes. Actually, let me do a quick plate solve exposure. Just make sure we still are centered on this thing. Yeah, that's pretty centered. The dithering will move it around. Okay, -15 degrees Celsius. A little under 30 minutes from Astrodark, but this thing's showing up just fine. Let's run the sequence. It's in. HFR is 2.38. It's nice and low, especially for my luminance filter. Got a nice number of stars in there, nice and crisp. All right, let's let this thing run. Okay, finally switched over to the Veil Nebula, and I have finished doing uh, Messier 10. And the first HA and the first O3 frames came in, and I absolutely love doing narrowbands, especially with all the light pollution I have. It is so nice being able to get through it. This is a 5-minute O3 frame, and let's load up the HA frame. Guiding's about 1.1 arc seconds. I know, here's the HA. HFR is a little bit high on it. I think the guider was still settling. Anyways, at the end of doing Messier 10, the guiding was around zero point 0.7, zero point 0.8, so I think this poor guiding that I have right now is just because I'm only, what is it, not even 30 degrees up. Uh, Sequence is set to end at 4:30, so I might bump on a couple more frames to here once I get a chance. Anyway, since Messier 10 is done, uh, can do the batch pre-processing. I've already calibrated and registered the light frames, and about to do the RGB. I just load everything in, the master flats that we made earlier, dark from the dark library, and I go into the folder where I saved everything, and I just make a batch pre-processing folder and tell it to export all the frames to there. And for images like this, where, they're just quick ones, I'm not putting too much time and effort into them. I won't bother with doing subframe selector for weighting. However, for some of the important images, or the ones that I consider most important that I sink tons of time into, such as the Veil Nebula. Hey, look, we got a plane. I will do subframe selector to do proper weighting of the frames. But when I stack these, I'll just tick the what is it? Evaluate noise box on image integration, and use that as the weights for the images. And also, after I do register all of these, I'll run them through Blink, and if there are instances where there's planes going through them, I'll just delete those files and not worry about them. Yeah, let's let this run. So yeah, okay, coming back to this. So coming back to Nina, the sequence should be good for the rest of the night. This will just do its thing, and I think it'll hit the meridian right at about when Astro Dark ends. And where's the setting? I usually image a little bit past the meridian. Uh, I haven't noticed any adverse effects to my images or my guiding quality at all. Having the counterweights higher than the telescope for a little bit, but after a while I do want to flip around so I don't have the telescope run into the mount. And I've already set up EQ mod to park to that no dust park position. Uh, that way, even if I do fall asleep and, I'm not here to baby this at all, or I guess when I do fall asleep, if I don't wake up until like 11 in the morning or something, I'll know that this will be fine. Even though Nina does have this new park on sequence end feature, I it only parks it to the home position, and I'd rather have the telescope mirror facing downwards instead of up. But yeah, if all goes well, hopefully this should be the last update until the morning. See you then. All right, well, it is a little bit before 5 a.m. and the imaging sequence on the Veil Nebula has just finished. Uh, Here's a one of the oxygen frames that came in, and there's a good amount of detail in there. And let's load up a hydrogen while we're here.
yeah, things went great other than uh, maybe a cloud or two coming by at one point and bring up the guiding. But now that it's in the end of sequence operations, warming the camera, yeah, let's park this to the home position, and I can just drag everything inside.